Hello, my name's Don Carson. I am an artist, designer, an illustrator, and an art director, and I've been working in the theme park and the game industry for the past 40 years or so. And I wanted an opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing in regards to sort of environmental storytelling, which is something that I think bridges both the theme park world and the video game world. So this presentation is mainly to talk about environmental storytelling and the work that I'm doing presently and how that work has fueled by the work I've done in the past for companies like Disney and Universal. So the definition of environmental storytelling just roughly is the art of creating a space that evokes a deeper narrative that your audience is encouraged to explore. So really it's creating an environment with hints to a larger narrative that allows the viewer to come to their own conclusions as to what the story is. And so this all started really when I was much younger. This is a picture of me at Disneyland. It's probably 1970, and you can tell because I'm wearing my polyester striped pants, which I'm sure I'm sweating like crazy in right in this picture. But my grandparents lived in Santa Ana, California, which was neighboring Disneyland, and we lived in San Francisco, and we would take trips down to Disneyland a couple times a year. And I just loved Disneyland. But the one thing I loved even more than Disneyland was I loved to draw. I drew all the time, and when I was in high school and then eventually going to college, I wanted to see whether or not there was a career that would let me draw for a living. So I became an illustration major at the San Francisco Academy of Art College in the early 80s. And the goal was to learn how to tell stories with my drawings. And like any potential career, there's always this one moment where you have an epiphany or where you come across something that sort of sets the groundwork for all the work that you'll be doing later in your career. And this one came in the form of this image. This is a painting done by N.C. Wyeth. He did this illustration for the book Treasure Island, and it depicts a scene early in the story where the character Blind Pew, that's Blind Pew in the picture, goes to the Benbow Inn, which is the building in the background, and delivers a black spot to Billy Bones. And the black spot is a torn page from a Bible with a black spot on it, which is telling Billy Bones that his life is forfeit because they're coming for him. And right after that, Blind Pew walks into the road and then is immediately struck down and killed by a carriage. Now, N.C. Wyeth, in his illustration, had a lot of ways he could have depicted this, but he chose to depict an image that did not include the carriage. Actually, you're not seeing the carriage at all. You're actually seeing this moment from the viewpoint of the carriage. And if anything, the viewpoint is probably from the eyes of the horse. This is just a fraction of a second before he's struck down and killed. And N.C. Wyeth wanted to capture this sort of energy of the moment. And I had learned up until this point that there were ways in which you could compose an image so that you could draw attention. You could make the most important thing the lightest thing in the image. Well, right here, the Benbow Inn is the lightest thing, so that's not going to work. So you could use the darkest thing, and that would be the way to draw your attention. But the darkest thing in this image is Blind Pew's cloak. Really, N.C. Wyeth wants you to look at his face and sort of empathize with his sort of stumbling around in the dark before he's killed. And the way that he does this is through arrows and pathways, is that every aspect of his design is causing your eye to move to the thing he wants you to look at, which is Blind Pew's face. And you can allow your eye, you have free will, to wander around inside this image and look at everything, but you're always going to return to that face because N.C. Wyeth wanted you to. Very much like watching water go down a drain, that moving your eye to the thing that's the most important, the most important narrative piece of the image blew my mind. The idea that it wasn't just making art or making a pretty picture. It was an opportunity to engage with an audience by having them look where you wanted them to look. So this sort of took my imagination, and when I finally graduated, I really quickly realized I really did not like the commercial illustration world. I was much more interested in the process of creating images than I was necessarily creating the finished painting as a final product. And so when I left, I quickly got a job as the art director for the Living History Center, and they produced the Renaissance Pleasure Fairs in Northern and Southern California. And these were 2 6-weekend events that happened during the year, and their goal was to take a piece of countryside and, through the use of plywood and hay bales, transform it into England during the Renaissance. And so my job there was to see whether or not I could add things to each event so that it continually grew, but also really reinforced the sort of story of creating English Renaissance. So I would see whether or not I could use these same principles that I was seeing in the N.C. Wyeth art in physical places. And so as far as the drawing is concerned, my drawings were less about producing an image that necessarily was going to be viewed by anything. My images were drawings to depict the ways in which we were going to go through the process of making it a reality, working with other people to build these things, and using artwork as a means to communicate that design and the process of that design for the people who were going to actually implement it. So this experience between my illustration background and then this working in themed environment, theatrical design, I ended up landing a job at the end of 2009, and actually 1989, for Walt Disney Imagineering, where I continued to do this. The illustrations were meant to communicate the idea to that large team that was going to implement them and build them in the parks. And one of the things that was wonderful about Imagineering at this time was there was a real dedication to try to catch the energy that was in those initial sketches in the finished product, something that I haven't necessarily witnessed in other companies since. But there's an understanding that there's a creative spark that happens in those initial concept sketches that will benefit the finished product if they can adhere to them as much as possible. So my work was doing very much the same thing, which was drawing details and elements and environments and using those drawings as a communication tool for the big team that was going to implement them. And so those drawings weren't necessarily meant to be things that hung on the wall. They were meant to be documents. And so as documents, I would write all over them and point out things that I may have thought were obvious, but things that I thought were important to get the idea across when they start to build this. And that would include bird's eye illustrations where I would sort of pry the roof off of an attraction so you could see how all the pieces work together, or sort of blow out an attraction so we could show how the track worked and how it interacted with the scenes, or bird's eyes that illustrated how a land might function and what it might look like. All of this before we go through the process of making models. The one real gift of working for Imagineering was sort of Walt's ghost, which stood over all the stuff that we did. And his lesson was the importance of story. And when we say story, when we're talking about theme parks, we're not talking about a linear sort of once upon a time in various chapters of images and events. We're much more talking about an environmental story, a story that the viewer actually starts to assemble in their own imagination as they're moving through this space. And I think where attractions work the best are when they leave a lot of that sort of specific narrative to the audience imagination, and the ones that don't work so much are ones where they lay it out very much like a once upon a time storybook with events. There are examples of that working, but more often than not, those attractions we think of as sort of timeless are the ones that don't necessarily adhere to a once upon a time and chapter version of the evolution of a story. And so when you look back at the people that Walt brought in when he was sort of inventing this sort of form of entertainment, it hadn't been done before. Certainly there were attractions and there were carnivals and there were rides, but he decided to bring in the artists that he had worked with at the studios. And it's worth noting that these people were in sort of the latter part of their careers. Up until this point, they had defined themselves as storytellers for the film industry. And so here, all of a sudden, they were in a new medium where they were using the skills of film to design environmental rides and attractions and lands. And when you look at the attractions that they produced during that time period, certainly they did vignette sketches, but really what they were doing was they were creating a film where you're moving from scene to scene, and your head, your vehicle, are the camera, and as you're moving through the space, the artful arrangement of the objects and the arrangement of the environment is there to evoke a narrative or a story that could pull you into it. Very much like NCYS illustration, every placement of every object is meant to draw your eye to the thing that's the most important. And so the other thing that was a gift is the importance of putting the designer's mind and eyes in the place of the consumer, the guest or the viewer. So in the upper right-hand corner, you see the show model for Splash Mountain's a Walt Disney World Splash Mountain attraction, and you can see how similar it is to the finished product. And on the left, whether or not Walt or the Imagineers or someone invented this, it was important that they elevated those models so that whenever you viewed them from the vantage point of the people who are going to be consuming it. It's always keeping in mind what is the experience of the viewer and what can you do in this design that's going to help communicate the viewer's relationship to what is happening in front of them. What is that narrative? What am I supposed to look at? And is there any way the designer can design the elements to guide your eye to those things that are most important that help the story move along or the environment really evoke what the designer is hoping to evoke. So along comes the digital world. In the mid-90s, a video game came out called Myst that kind of, once again, sort of changed my perspective. It was when color monitors were first coming out and CD-ROMs were becoming available. And what Myst did was it proved to me that you could conceivably use the same techniques and all of the training of a theme park designer and apply it to a virtual place as well. So while a theme park attraction might take you a minute to 3 minutes to go through, Myst allows you to spend 40 plus hours exploring an environment and understanding it. And I really clearly could see that there was another place for this sort of storytelling to happen. And so I left Imagineering when my son was born, and we moved to the Pacific Northwest, and I started working with game companies with the ultimate goal to see if I could apply some of these theme park principles to the games we were working on. And what I quickly discovered was that the game industry was not particularly open to this idea. In fact, they really didn't quite know why Myst made so much money and why it was so popular. So after a while, out of frustration, I ended up writing an article in 2000 that sort of described the missed opportunity between the theme park and the computer game world to learn from each other. That there was opportunities to be able to use and leverage this idea of environmental storytelling to make games richer and to learn some of the mechanics that make games popular so that we can make theme parks better. And ultimately, my goal was to take myself to a place that let me go somewhere I could never go, let me be someone I could never be, and let me do things I could never do. So that was kind of my focus. And this article actually landed me a job as the art director with Will Harvey, who was starting a startup in 2000 called There.com. And his goal was to leverage the sort of new technology of sort of massive multiplayer games and see whether or not you could create an environment where people would gather from anywhere in the world for the sole purpose of just interacting, to be able to chat and visit within the context of a virtual environment with an avatar. And what he wanted me to do was to bring some of that theme park sensibility so that those places just weren't pretty places, but they were places that had some kind of story or some reason to exist. Sadly, There didn't succeed. It does exist on the web, but it really was way before its time. And its biggest challenge was that we were trying to get this massive world, even before games like World of Warcraft had come out, to run on anybody's computer, including your grandmother's computer, which meant that everything had to be incredibly low poly. We had very, very limited texture budgets. But what we did have was we had the ability to change the lighting and the color in a way that would, despite the fact that these environments were low poly, really evoke a place, make it a place you want it to be. And I was continuing to use my drawing skills to design all the various parts and assets that would go to assemble these environments, very much like sort of populating a playset or a dollhouse. And eventually it grew into another company, which Will started, where we took that one step further, which was to make small, rich environments as backdrops for humans to interact that sort of evoked the perfect cafe or the perfect little beach lagoon or a haunted hotel that you could visit in, or even sort of the Martha Stewart sort of autumn Connecticut environment with the leaves changing. Whether or not we could create low poly environments that would allow people to experience conversations together with in the context of whatever the narrative we were offering or they were interested in interacting with. And so this created a sort of a hybrid career where I bounced back and forth between theme park work and game work. And the theme park work that I was using, I was leveraging a lot of the game work that I had been doing and the tools that I was using. So often, although I was being asked to do illustrations in a more traditional way, I would build a model first, or I would make sure that the environment worked spatially and to scale. So whether or not the final product was a concept sketch or the final product was a model, both were informed on the theming and also the scale. So I was always keeping in mind what it was like to be in the space. And this was incredibly helpful when it came to communicating and to the team that would build it. So the architects and the show set people who were going to take and build this thing in reality. And so although I might be asked to do an illustration that was an elevation to describe what this would look like, I would often build a model. And sometimes if I had the luxury of time, I'd even texture it so that I'd get a good idea of what this felt like in space, not just what the theming might look like in an elevation. And when virtual reality became a thing and something that was available, I would take those very same models and I would jump inside of them in VR. And one of the most valuable parts of VR is that in the first 10 seconds of arriving, you already will know what isn't working. Something that normally doesn't happen until you have a hard hat on and you're way far down into the production cycle and it's way too expensive to make changes. So being able to wander around in your designs in virtual reality really, really helps you understand what is and isn't working and allows you to make decisions about the design really up front during the concept phase that you never could before, all thanks to VR headsets and the ability to jump into your designs. So along comes COVID, and here I am in an industry that is designing large environments for lots of people to congregate in. So the work pretty much dried up. So myself and lots of my colleagues found themselves with lots of time in their hands. So I decided to do something I've been wanting to do for ages, which was I wanted to design a fictional dark ride that I could document and present on the internet the various stages of the design process so they could get a look at the kind of work that we do in the theme park world. So everything from building a paper model and using my camera to move around inside it, to bring it into the digital world and starting to bring virtual cameras through it. Over the course of COVID, I worked on this with a good musician friend, Cullen Vance, who ended up writing the music and actually a song for this little ride. And I was able to bring it into Unity and move the camera through it and produce a video ride through, but I was also able to produce a VR ride through that allowed you to actually sit in the vehicle and move through the space and look around and look behind you and look at the ceiling. And both the ride-through and the VR ride-through are available on YouTube. And if you have a VR headset, you can actually ride through this little COVID project of mine. But this inspired another ex-Imagineer friend of mine, Daniel Rover Singer, who said, gosh, I wish someone would recreate the 1958 original Alice in Wonderland ride as it appeared when it opened. And it has since evolved and improved over the years, but he really wanted to be able to ride and be inside the attraction that now no longer existed. So we both had time on our hands, so we said, well, why don't we tackle that one? So we did that very same thing with documentation and some plan drawings and some help from some industry friends. We actually recreated the original 1958 version of the Alice in Wonderland ride as best we could. And I brought on two other wonderful, talented friends, Karen Thompson and Heidi Hirsch. Both were colorists at Imagineering. And we did our very best to recreate all the scenes that you would have seen in that original attraction. And best of all, because of VR, we were able to not only ride it, which you can also do on YouTube, but also we could meet inside of it and have meetings and discussions as we were producing it. So each of us would have a different scene that we would be coloring. We could visit it in its raw, drawn form, but we could then also visit it as all of the color imagery and textures are starting to be applied. So during that same time, we would gather in VR in a game called Walkabout Mini Golf. And it was a way for us to stay connected while we were all shut down. And really quickly, we started to see the similarities between what Walkabout was doing with their environments and the work we've been doing for a couple of decades in the theme park world. And finally, when this Bogey's Bonanza, this Western course came out, I said to Heidi and Karen, I've just got to write them a letter and just tell them what a marvelous job they're doing. They really are nailing this storytelling with their environments. And so I did. I wrote them a letter and was graciously asked to meet with them and give a presentation of the work I'd been doing. And at the end of it, I asked if they were hiring at all. And Lucas Martel, who is the founder of Walkabout Mini Golf, hired me, and that was 2 years ago. And since then, I've been working with the team to sort of bridge that disconnect between the theme park world and the game world and see whether we could create something that was a hybrid of both sort of a theme park attraction, but also a game that you could meet in VR. And so that's the work that we've been doing for the last 2.5 years, is doing our very best to produce very, very highly themed and yet low poly environments due to the technology's limitations, and do it for projects that we've come up with ourselves, but also work with IP partners to come up with ideas that we could share that are based upon IPs that we love so much. So really what we're doing is we're creating story-rich worlds where you can also play mini golf. So although we are fundamentally a mini golf game, the mini golf is really the sort of excuse for gathering, but what happens when people gather is the most important thing. In fact, really one of the compliments we get a lot is people saying, I've reconnected with my dad, or I've reconnected with a relative who lives 600 miles away, and we just don't stay connected enough, and now we get together once or twice a week and play a little hour-long miniature golf game in these various environments we're designing. So we've done a ton of them. Recently, we were working with the Jim Henson Company on recreating the world of Labyrinth from the classic cult film from the 80s. We have taken players to the bottom of the ocean in the lost city of Atlantis. We have done a series of Jules Verne courses, and currently we're working around the world in 80 days, but we've released 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where you can play through the Nautilus, and we recently released the Journey to the Center of the Earth, where you can go on a subterranean journey through all the various realms from Jules Verne's book. We've created landscapes completely made of candy and icing and filled with rivers made of chocolate. And we've recently released a sort of tongue-in-cheek, googie version of a James Bond villain with the tropical island with the volcano caldera with the killer robot being built inside of it. We just released a Nordic realm of Alfheim, which is a nod to the world of elves. And in coming full circle, we actually partnered with the wonderful people at Cyan, and we recreated Mist Island as a miniature golf park, both a daytime and a nighttime version, which was just a joy to work on. So if I was to describe our process at Mighty Coconut, the company that I'm working for now, making Walkabout Mini Golf. First is Mighty Coconut started as a film production company first, so we tend to think cinematically as opposed to necessarily in a game way. One of the challenges I've discovered over the years is that various industries can have their own vocabulary and kind of stay within their box. So the theme park industry may argue that a decision is too much like a game and not enough like a theme park. And a game company might say that's too much like a theme park and not enough like a game. So although we have filmmakers, we have theme park people, and we have game designers working at Mighty Coconut, we really are working towards a more cinematic experience necessarily than traditionally just a theme park or just a game experience. We all work like an ensemble or a jazz band. We are a small company of around 30 people right now, filled with both creative people and technical people. And the project is handed through its life cycle through the hands of each individual person working on the project. And they each get time with the design so that they can add their own sort of perspective on it. There's an overarching story we're going for, but how that's enhanced and how that ultimately is implemented is decided upon by each individual sort of artist as they're putting their hands on it. And the other thing that's kind of unique is that I've worked on lots of projects where there's a technical team that's responsible for sort of getting it, through the finish line and making sure everything works. But our tech team is really our tech art team, and they have as much creative influence over the environment as our design team as they begin at the beginning of the production. So while traditionally the art end on the front gets to make demands as to what the direction of the project is going to be, the tech team is equally responsible for making choices that support that design, but also enhance and add to it so that the finished product is better than any one individual could have imagined it was going to be once they finished. So just to describe our process, we're creating a virtual reality experience where you're going to be inside of the virtual world. So it seems important to us to design within that environment as well. So one of the tools we use a lot is Gravity Sketch. And we can collaboratively meet inside of the world as we're building it. So on the far left, that is that lot of scribbling is about an hour and a half of Lucas, Henning, and I, collaboratively sketching out to scale the next course. And although it doesn't look like it, a lot of decisions have been made, and we were able to walk away from that scribble and say, yes, this is the design that we believe in, and let's start the process of making it real. And like within the same day, we'll start to take those scribbles and we'll start to add walls and add finishing pieces to sort of rough out and refine that initial scribble so that we have something that we can use to communicate to the rest of the team. Now, all this is happening in VR, and all of this is something that you can jump down at scale and wander around inside of. And what's amazing is that the final project that came out 10 months after this initial sketch is very, very much like a lot of the choices that we've made in these early scribbly sketches and early refining models. We might also take that rough model and just do a really quick drawing over the top of it, just to make sure that we understand what those scribbles mean, and then we'll go right into refining that sketch and start bringing in rough assets or create assets within Gravity Sketch so we start to lay out the course. And you can see on the right-hand side, those little green carpets are representations of where the 18th holes will be, but we haven't talked about what those holes will actually be and how they'll work into the environment. The environment kind of comes first, and then we start working with the mechanics and the design of each hole to help support that larger story. Sometimes we'll actually start with a sketch if it's really a daunting, in this particular case, IP like the Labyrinth. I did a bird's eye illustration of what the course could be like, and then we translated that in Gravity Sketch to something that was more realistic, that allowed you to explore it and for us to put our 18 holes inside of it. it's also worth mentioning that very much in the sort of filmmaker mindset, we're breaking down the scenes of each of the beats within that movie to the 18 holes that we are going to be offering. So there is a lot of thought that goes into what the progression is from one space to the other, very much like a theme park. And then each one of these scenes has an opportunity of a reveal, whether it's an establishing shot at the beginning, or you turn a corner, or you go through a threshold, or you come up from underground, and the next scene is presented to you in the best, most visually, compositionally pristine way possible. Very much, again, like that N.C. Wyeth painting. Are there ways in which we can present each environment so that they support this larger story that we're trying to tell? Then we'll start to move into sort of the concept sketching of what those environments must be like. And there's a lot of brainstorming where there's sort of no bad ideas. We just sort of scribble everything down and we start to whittle through it and figure out which environment best supports this larger story we want to tell. So these are some of the concept sketches for Journey to the Center of the Earth, and it's starting to decide what those scenes might be and what it might be like to be in them. But also we're making miniature golf games, so we also want to start talking about how the thematic treatment of the holes is going to help support that larger story. So whether it's Atlantis with large sort of sculptures of Poseidon, or it's the various scenes and characters that you're going to see in Labyrinth, we want to understand in a sketch form what those experiences may or may not be as we start going into 3D. Also, we're looking for some kind of cohesive shape language of the holes. So how is the shape of the holes and what is the gameplay? How does it best support the story we're telling and the environment that we're starting to create? And we pride ourselves, although it can be tough, to be different from course to course. So what we're offering you isn't just the same kinds of miniature golf holes slapped into themed environments. The holes themselves are really a part of that experience, and the design language of those holes is there to support the design choices we're making in the environment. And then also we'll do sketches of sort of story moments or story vignettes. So whether it's the lost city of Zazura, an Egyptian city that was lost for thousands of years under the sands of the desert, the sands are starting to recede, and they're uncovering sort of the day-to-day life moments that were frozen in time, activities that support sort of what you might find in an archaeological dig site of what they were building. Were they carving stones? Were they painting murals? Or you can also see that in the lower right-hand corner for the sort of James Bond-esque villain's lair, our mechanic is lasers. Is there a way that the evil scientists have been using those lasers to do things other than just necessarily incinerating your golf ball? And you can also see our very, very obvious tribute to Indiana Jones' treasure room from Indiana Jones' Lost Ark film. But now as we're starting to do much more unique custom environments, we're building pretty much every single asset that's in that to support the story we're trying to tell. So before we start building them, I'll start sketching those assets that are unique, that aren't just rocks and palm trees, that are those elements that are stylistically supporting the story we're trying to tell. And then these will help inform those 3D models that are built after. And so those 3D models too also need to run on a variety of VR headsets and untethered headsets like the Quest. They don't have the horsepower necessarily to generate sort of the console level or a PC computer level of detail. So we have to be clever about using as few polygons as possible to create simple shapes. But that doesn't mean that those simple shapes can't really evoke a level of charm. Something that I hope to bring from my experience at Disney was there's a sense of charm and appeal in every object that makes an environment that helps it sort of be quintessentially what you expect to experience, whether you're in Tibet or you're in a submarine underneath the ocean with Captain Nemo, is each object, even in its simple form, is there to support this larger story. And we can make our objects as charming as possible, but ultimately what really, really makes them work is how they're arranged and how they're placed in the environment. And we call this process set decking, which I think is something that comes from the filmmaking world, is that can you arrange those objects to suggest that people have been here, that you've just missed them, they've just done something, that we're, as physical creatures, we're constantly going through our world making decisions based upon observation. We're very much like detectives. And when we see two chairs sitting next to each other looking at a vista, we can imagine that people have used that, and maybe they have just left, and maybe they had a relationship between each other. How can you place those objects so that it evokes a story or draws your eye to the next thing that we want you to look at? And so when we go into a rough modeling phase where we've taken those initial collaborative scribbles, we've tightened them up, and we're starting to tighten them up more, and we're starting to place placeholder assets and some finish assets in the environment to start building out the scene. So that process looks very much like this, which is you're in VR, you're using a program like Gravity Sketch, you're grabbing the assets and you're starting to put them into place. And this experience is very much like a playset or like arranging furniture in a dollhouse, except you have the ability of grabbing any piece of the furniture for that dollhouse and manipulate it and to adjust it so that it fits better in that environment. And then you can get inside of it and see what that experience is going to be like. Something that is impossible to do with the traditional 2D, 3D application that works on a desktop. Although we have made marvelous films using it, the ability to jump inside the model and be able to experience what the player is going to experience is incredibly valuable. And then we'll take those initial layouts and we'll do what we call a draw over, which was we'll put a flimsy over the top of the rough model, and we'll start to sketch the details that we're hoping to apply to it to create a sense of place. And then what are the opportunities of the props that need to be built to help meet the ideals that are in these initial sketches. And so then we go into a model refinement phase where we're starting to place the objects, but more importantly, we're starting to firm up the rooms, the environments, the landscape, so that it supports these stories, but also refine them and optimize them so that these environments will run on all the headsets that we're hoping to produce it for. And this is a marvelous opportunity for the modelers that are working on it to start making decisions as to how to best support the story that is being sort of suggested with the props that we're placing. And so that process is you're in a virtual environment like Gravity Sketch. You have this huge sort of library of assets at your disposal, and you take your environment, which here is just represented as a little corner, but you can reach into this palette and grab objects and then finesse them into place so that you are starting to play around it like a play set. You can go back to the environment, grab another piece, and all the while you're sort of intuitively trying to decide how that piece will best marry with the pieces with it. What's the story it's trying to tell, and do they relate to each other? Will they lead your eye from one place to the next? And even better is you can bring those objects in, and you didn't just buy these objects at an antique store. You can actually rescale them and alter them in the virtual environment. But best of all is that once you started to place these items, at any moment you can dive into the space and experience it from the scale that the player will be experiencing it when they're inside of it, and even dive even deeper and start to nudge and place those objects so that they don't look like a computer's placed them. They look like humans have interacted with the objects. It's a level of finesse that is just very, very hard to do on a traditional computer, but very intuitive to do when you're in virtual reality. And so we'll end up with a version of each of the courses where all the objects have been placed, the geometry is firming up, but we haven't gotten to the part where we're starting to theatrically light and determine what the mood is of the space. But we're starting to know that the holes work. We've been play testing it, so we know these pieces will work. We've walked around inside this environment. It's very much like going through an attraction or being on stage while the work lights are up. The mood isn't there, but all the prop pieces are in the right place. So the next phase is to do sort of a color draw over version. And this is the work of our very talented graphic artist, Zach Alexander. And Zach's style really permeates all of the projects we produce. His aesthetic, both his color and his shape language aesthetic, really influence what our product looks like. And if there's a cohesive thread that goes through all the things we work on, really it's Zach's work, where he is playfully and experimenting with ways in which color and light can really evoke the story we're all collectively trying to produce. He also does all the graphic elements that are inside the worlds, so that he's designing all the graphics you see, all the signs you see, all the album covers you see inside the world. It also helps make there be a cohesive thread that runs through all of our projects. And then finally it goes to our tech team, where they're starting to really bring it into Unity. Our lighting designer is working with Zach's concepts and then bringing his own sensibilities into what's available as far as shaders and light effects, the way that light bounces off of surfaces, and really brings a theatricality that as much as we've poured all of our inspiration into the placement of all the objects, it isn't until we start seeing it here that we really understand what it is we're producing. And I have to say that I am always pleasantly surprised by the courses as we deliver them, because they far exceed my expectations of what is possible with low poly. And they're incredibly theme park-like in their way in which to transport you into these spaces. So yes, our product is a miniature golf game. Miniature golf is the reason you're here, but each of the environments has been designed to create a backdrop that will pull you into this world. Every design choice has been made to help guide your eye and fulfill your expectations and exceed those expectations about what you might encounter in whatever the environment we're offering. You can experience it linearly as you walk through, but also we can fly through these spaces. And as nice as these images are, there's just no way to really describe what it's like to be here without actually going there. So if you have a VR headset, I highly recommend that you try Walkabout Mini Golf and wear the eyes of a designer, of a themed environment creator, because we really are creating environments that are doing all the things that we're attempting to do in a theme park, and yet we're doing it in a VR headset where you can meet anybody around the world and interact with them. Also, Zach is responsible for our advertising and front-facing imagery, including these amazing posters and promotional pieces that initially are teases that describe things that are coming, but then ultimately become the marketing pieces that we use to advertise our product. But what's also important too is that they establish sort of a mood and a high watermark or goal for the team to aspire to. So it's all environmental storytelling. The two industries, theme park and game world, have similar goals, and they are done with a similar base of skills. So whether or not we're doing a theme park attraction that's going to be physical, or we're doing a virtual environment that's going to remain in VR, we're using the same sensibilities, same design ideas, but the way we go about it is slightly different. So if you were to compare a theme park project, it will start in sort of a blue sky concepting phase where there's no bad ideas. You're just coming up with as many ideas as you possibly can and applying it. Then you move into a feasibility stage, and that feasibility stage is where you start to pull from those concepts to narrow it down to a design that is buildable. Then finally, you go into a schematic design phase, where you're really sort of committing to whether or not these things are buildable and affordable, balancing continuously those designs that will and will not work. Then you go into design development phase, and then finally a production and installation phase, where all those things will come together. So in the virtual environment world, ours are somewhat similar, but we go through a concept phase where we're distilling all the ideas into something that is buildable. But we are also a game, so we also need to to be focused on the design of what the gameplay experience is going to be like. Then we go into an art and modeling phase where we translate those concepts into actual pieces of models and environments. Then it goes into a lighting and tech art phase, and then finally it goes into a quality assurance and release phase, very much like the production and installation and opening that happens in theme parks. So some of the project requirements, a theme park project has requirements like safety requirements. You can't die here. Lots of decisions have to be made to make sure that your experience is safe and no one can be harmed. There's ADA compliance. You have to make your attraction something that is most people can experience. So the width of things, the safety of getting to exits, all of those things have to be taken into consideration. We're building something that's going to be physical, so there are construction costs, which is a sliding scale depending on when you're building something, materials, and where in the world you're building and who you're using to build it. Teams can be huge. I've worked on teams that started out with only a handful of people in the concept phase and ended up being thousands of people once it had gone through all the fabricators and construction and the contractors that are responsible for creating it. We're creating a physical thing, so travel expenses is an issue. You have to go to the place that you are building it, and that might be in another country or another continent. And your team, which could be hundreds to thousands of people, are constantly traversing back and forth between the place that's designed and the place that's being built. And then finally, your product is going to be consumed physically, so you have to go to the place and physically go there to experience the finished product. And the life cycle of that process could be roughly from about 3 to 5 years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars to billions of dollars. The virtual version of that is that your main limitation is the power of the computer, the CPU, and the limits it puts upon what you can put on that screen, what amount of math that your headset or your computer can crunch to make the visuals work. So you're constantly keeping in mind making it something that's experienceable within the limitations of the technology. There are no safety requirements. You do want to make sure that you don't want to make something that someone's going to become sick because of motion sickness, so you're trying to keep your frame rate as high as possible. There's no real construction costs. Everything is virtual. It's all polygons. So more, it's the cost of the team's hours to produce everything from scratch. Your team can be completely remote, or it can be physical. We have team members in Australia and in the UK and in Oregon and Idaho and Austin, Texas. And we all have been building these environments together from those locations. And a project lifecycle is basically 9 to 12 months. We're working on a new course, probably 7 courses or so at the same time, and then producing roughly every 6 to 8 weeks, we come up with a new one. So it's like producing a new attraction every 6 to 8 weeks. So it's worth mentioning at the very end, although it seems like a non sequitur, that the world of AI is something that is is looming as a tool that we can conceivably use, and we at Mighty Coconut and at Walkabout are using AI, but we tend to use it much more as a brainstorming tool. We kind of use it the way we would use Google image search or Pinterest to come up with imagery to help support the ideas and guide the design, but not as the design itself. But for every beautiful place that we create has the same intangible quality that you can feel when you arrive, and that is you can really sense the hands of those who created it. When people arrive at our projects, despite the fact they're mainly there to play miniature golf, they're sort of hit with something that's not something you can grasp. And I believe that it's that ensemble sort of jazz band quality of our production path. The fact that so many humans have made so many choices about every single decision within that environment, that I feel that AI does a marvelous job of creating incredibly beautiful imagery, but it does lack that sense of thought that went into every single choice, every hand that was touched on every surface. And I feel as though we're delivering that with our virtual projects. So thank you very much. That's really sort of the life cycle of where we've been going and where we're continuing to go. I really feel that I live in both the theme park world and I live in the virtual world. and I don't see a real separation. And as designers yourselves, I hope that you can see that there is potential in both those environments. You're not limited to just the physical or just the virtual. Stories can be told and people can be transported to places no matter what the medium is of the final product. So thank you very much.